Okay, last time I was here was for a Crenshaw talk and talking about the Crenshaw house or the old slave house. And this time I'm going to be talking about the river pirates and the outlaws that operated around Cave-in-Rock and around Hardin County back in the 1700s and early 1800s. And these are all in my book, Cave-in-Rock Pirates and Outlaws, and I have copies of the book here if anyone's interested. I also have a book on how the Shawnee National Forest came to be that has a bunch of pictures from the 30s and the 40s of sites around southern Illinois. And if you'd like one, we have some here tonight. And if you want to just thumb through one after the talk's over, feel free to come and pick one up and take a look at it also.
Okay.
So when we talk about river pirates, one of the things that we need to talk about first is why Cave-in-Rock? You know, why did all this happen at Cave-in-Rock? Or why were there these outlaws even in the Cave-in-Rock area? And I like to blame Kentucky.
Of course you do.
Kentucky became a state in 1792. And the river pirate era is actually just a small time period in our history. It's only about a 10-year period of time between 1790 and 1800 is when the river pirates, what we think of as river pirates around Cave-in-Rock, were operating. Now, there was outlaw activity that continued on into the 1800s, of course. But as far as the river pirate goes and robbing people as they came down the river, is really only about a 10-year period. And the reason why I say I blame Kentucky is because when Kentucky became a state in 1792, that meant that there was enough people living in Kentucky for it to be granted statehood. You had to have a certain population before you were able to form a state in the United States at that time. And so in 1792, Kentucky becomes a state, and along with statehood comes the population, and along with the population you've got law and order comes into play here, because it's not just a no man's land on the frontier anymore. Once you have a state, once you have people living in towns, you start having sheriffs, you have town marshals, you have people coming in, you have the court system, you have law and order that comes along with it. Well, when there's law and order and things of that nature, it's not the best idea to be a horse thief, a counterfeiter, or something of that nature. So you have Kentucky just south of here. You have the Ohio River, and everything north of the Ohio River is part of the Northwest Territory. It had been part of the Northwest Territory ever since the American Revolution. And when George Rogers Clark came into the area and took possession of the Northwest Territory of Illinois and Indiana away from the British during the American Revolution, at the close of the American Revolution, all of that area north of the Ohio River became the Northwest Territory. And by proclamation of Congress, this territory was going to be set aside for statehood, and as people moved into the area, then states were carved out of this Northwest Territory. So Ohio was the first state, Indiana was the second state, and then Illinois was the third state formed out of this Northwest Territory. And of course, Illinois became a state in 1818. And so during this period of time, when, like I said, Kentucky became a state in 1792, well, the Ohio River becomes the boundary of the United States, essentially, because that's the last state. Everything north of the Ohio River in this Northwest Territory is a no man's land. Now, were there people here? Yes, there was people living here. There was squatters here. There was trappers here. At the close of the American Revolution, some of the French. Let me back up. Some of the French that were here before, during the French and Indian War, they lost control of Illinois and Missouri. And at the close of the French and Indian War, the British came and took possession. Well, Britain just took over those old French settlements and continued to inhabit them, like Kaskaskia. And then at the close of the American Revolution, it became a territory of the United States. Well, it was a territory of the United States, but there were still people living in these settlements back from when it was a British possession, back from when it was a French possession. So there was a few people living here in isolated spots, but it was a territory. It wasn't an organized state. And so there was a lot of frontier. There was a lot of just woods. There was still some Native Americans living here in pockets. And so there wasn't a lot of people living here. And if you were going to do something ornery, coming across the Ohio River into Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, into this area was a good place to go. Now, Ohio wasn't as good of a spot because they were already becoming a state themselves. But Illinois was a long way from statehood at this time. So the other thing that happened during this period of time is the people in Tennessee and Kentucky that had settled there began using the rivers as their interstate to get goods to sell them at market. And during this time, the rivers were important travel routes for getting any extra goods that you were producing to a market. And the markets were essentially New Orleans and Natchez, Mississippi. And to get there, the easiest way to get there was to build yourself a flatboat, load it up with all your goods that you had, and then travel the rivers. So going up the Cumberland River, going up the Tennessee River, going up the Green River, they all ended up at the Ohio River, and then from the Ohio River, then you could travel down to the Mississippi, and then down the Mississippi you reached Natchez or you reached New Orleans, where the markets were. And basically that's where the shipping was, to go ahead and take it to other ports along the coast of the United States, or even to take things to Europe. And so as people started traveling these routes on these flatboats, you know, most of the time the flatboat was just guarded by maybe a couple of guys that came together. Maybe a farmer and his neighbor would come together, and whatever extra goods that they had, they'd go in together, build their raft, their flatboat, and so there might have just been a couple of guys on this boat, or on this flatboat, taking the goods to market. So it was relatively left undefended. And so that's what made this a prime area for criminal activity. And of course, why Cave-in-Rock? You've got that nice cave there. It makes an excellent shelter in Cave-in-Rock, you know, for these outlaws to hide in. The other reason at this time that Cave-in-Rock became a hotbed of criminal activity is because a group of regulators in Kentucky. Regulators was just a vigilante group that would form together. A posse would be another good way of thinking about it. The regulators were a group of people that came together to drive out any criminal activity in an area. Well, at this point in time, Red Banks, Kentucky was a hive of criminal activity. If you don't recognize Red Banks, Kentucky, you might recognize it as Henderson, Kentucky, because that's what Henderson was called before it became Henderson, Kentucky. It was Red Banks, Kentucky. And all the criminal elements seemed to migrate to Red Banks. And so the regulators got together and drove them out of Red Banks, and when they drove the criminals out of Red Banks, the next place that they set up shop was at the cave in Cave-in-Rock. All right, we're going to talk about, and here's a picture of the Northwest Territory at the end of the Revolution. And here's a picture of a flatboat. This would be a very fancy flatboat. Most of the flatboats that they had were just flat rafts with maybe a tent on one side of it for some shelter, and then they would just have all their barrels and their casks of goods piled on top of it. This would be a fancy one. All right, so the horse thieves, counterfeiters, highwaymen, and river pirates that we're going to talk about tonight, and really in their order of appearance in the Cave-in-Rock area, is Philip Alston. He was a counterfeiter. John Duff, this is better known as Duff the Counterfeiter. So naturally he was a counterfeiter. Then Samuel Mason is who we usually, when you think of a river pirate in the river pirate era, it's really Samuel Mason is who we're thinking about. If you watch How the West Was Won, the character in How the West Was Won that was the river pirate, he was portraying a Samuel Mason type character. That's who he was really portraying. And then in the movie Davy Crockett and the River Pirates, Samuel Mason is one of the characters in that movie, along with the Harpe brothers. We're going to talk about Big Harpe and Little Harpe, and then we're going to close out the discussion talking about Merrick and Roswell Sturdivant. They were counterfeiters, and they operated in the 1820s, so after the river pirate area, and actually after Illinois became a statehood. So these are the ones we're going to talk about tonight. Counterfeiting at this time, and I guess let's just start the discussion with Philip Alston. Philip Alston, like all of these guys that we're talking about, all of them were born out east because that's where the population center was. So they were in North Carolina, Virginia, in that area in the Carolinas. They were out there when during the American Revolution. Some of the men that we're talking about, these outlaws, even fought in the American Revolution. Samuel Mason was an officer during the American Revolution before he came west and became an outlaw. Philip Alston, he's the first counterfeiter to operate probably out of the cave in Cave-in-Rock. And he was born in, I think, the Carolinas or Virginia. He ended up making his way to Natchez, Mississippi, and he was living in Natchez, and he started his counterfeiting operation in Natchez. And there's talk that he went into the Catholic Church there, and the Catholic Church in Natchez had a nice big gold cross in it. And he went and he stole the gold cross and he melted it down into coinage. And that was his first counterfeiting operation, and it's also what got him driven out of Natchez. And so from Natchez, he made it to Russellville, Kentucky. And in Russellville, Kentucky, he operated there for a while. He started counterfeiting there, and he got driven out of Russellville, Kentucky. And then the next place we find Philip Alston is at Red Banks. Again, I was mentioning Red Banks seemed like it was where all the criminal element in this part of the country eventually ended up. And that's where Philip ended up. And he operated out of Red Banks for a while, and then he made his way downriver and he set up shop, a counterfeiting operation in the cave at Cave-in-Rock. The counterfeiting operation that he did was a melting metals down, usually lead, and using a mold like this picture of one that's on the slideshow here. They would melt down the lead, and then they would put it into a mold like this. And so today, coins are stamped, and we make our coins today by stamping. But back then, when they were going to counterfeit a coin, they would take a legitimate coin, they would make a clay mold out of it, and then out of that clay mold, then they would put something, make something more substantial. This is a metal mold, and then they would put the mold together, pour liquid lead down it, and that's how they would make their counterfeit coinage. And this is a picture of an actual mold for making counterfeit coins. Philip Alston operated out of the cave in Cave-in-Rock for a while. During this period of time, Duff, the counterfeiter, or John Duff, he came upriver, and he established himself in a house where Caseyville, Kentucky is now. The Tidewater Creek empties into the Ohio River there at Caseyville, Kentucky. And it's said that John Duff's cabin that he had was on a bluff overlooking where the trade water empties into the Ohio River. So John Duff came upriver and he met Philip Alston, and Philip Alston is the one that taught John Duff the counterfeiting and how to counterfeit. To kind of finish up Philip Alston's story, he left the area after Duff took over his operation here. He went back down to the Mississippi, and then he ended up dying in on the west side of the Mississippi River in what was then Spanish territory. He got driven out of the Natchez area again, and then went over into the Spanish territory, and then he was killed in Spanish territory. Let me back up here and just mention the timeline of the people we're talking about. Philip Alston was born in either 1740 or 1741. He died in 1799. Duff the counterfeiter was born in either 1759 or 1760. He died in 1799 or 1805. There's a 6-year spread on when he possibly died. Samuel Mason was born in 1739. He died in 1803 down in Mississippi. Mickey Harpe, Big Harpe, he died in 1799. We'll tell the story about that over in Kentucky when we get to his brother Wiley, Little Harpe. He died in 1804 down in Mississippi. And then the Sturdivants, there's no information about when they were born or really when they died that's very reliable, let's say. But the story we're going to talk about then was in the 1820s. So you can see that if 1790 to 1799 is the river pirate operation, you can see that a lot of them were here towards the end of their life. and a lot of them have lost their life, in this area because of their criminal activity. So Philip Alston is the first river pirate that operated in the area. John Duff is the next one. He started his operation out of the cave, following what Philip Alston was doing. He lived at the Caseyville, Kentucky area. Of course, Caseyville wasn't there at the time. That's the general area they lived in. It's said that he found a lead deposit on the Saline River, and he would go up the Saline River and he would mine his lead, and then he would take and melt it down, make his coins. And then what they're really using the cave for is a base of operations, like a banking center, for people to come to the cave and trade their trade a legitimate script for the counterfeit coinage. So they didn't really make the coins so much there, as that's where they would hide out, and that was the place where people could come and trade legitimate currency for counterfeit currency. And that's how John Duff did his operation. John Duff actually has another story or another link to history. When George Rogers Clark came down during the American Revolution and came down the Ohio River with the intention of going to Kaskaskia and taking Kaskaskia away from the British, he landed at Fort Massac. And he was looking for a guide, someone that could guide him over the land and surprise the British at Kaskaskia, and instead of trying to make their way back up the Mississippi River. And so while he was at Fort Massac, it's said that a John Duff is the one that put him in contact with a hunter that could lead him across the Illinois, across land to Kaskaskia. And the John Duff mentioned that helped George Rogers Clark during the American Revolution is probably the same John Duff that became Duff the Counterfeiter later on in the 1790s. And so Duff is the one that helped George Rogers Clark, and then later on he ended up being in the Hardin County area, in the Caseyville, Kentucky area. This counterfeit coinage started causing problems in the area because people would realize they're getting counterfeit coins, and at this period of time, really the only law and order, and we're talking about the 1790s, the only law and order in southeastern Illinois was at Fort Massac at the time. And it caught back to the commander at Fort Massac, Commander Pike, and Commander Pike is the one that Pike's Peak is named after, his family. And so Commander Pike, that's down at Fort Massac, on 3 different occasions sends some people up to arrest John Duff. He knew he was operating out of Cave-in-Rock. He knew that he was living in the Caseyville area. And the first time that they tried to arrest him, they went to Caseyville to arrest him, and his wife was actually doing laundry. And the story goes that when John Duff saw the soldiers coming to arrest him, he took her kettle that she was doing the laundry in, and he tossed it in the river to cool it down. Then he put that over his head, and he walked across the river with that kettle, and breathing the air inside that kettle, he made it over to Battery Rock on the Illinois shore. Battery Rock is just across the river from Caseyville. And so he escaped the soldiers by using that kettle as an air breather to get across the river. Now, I don't know if you want to believe all this folklore or not, but that's the story. The second time that they came to arrest John Duff, and it's still from Fort Massac, they sent people up and they caught him on the Saline River at his mine, where he was mining the lead. And they caught him and they tied him up, and John Duff had a black slave that he also had with him that he used. Of course, a lot of people had black slaves during this period of time, and plus he was living in Kentucky, so it was legal over there. And when Duff and his black slave were captured, they put them in the canoe and they started taking their canoe back to Fort Massac to put him under trial. They tied Duff up, but they didn't tie his slave up because they figured the slave would be so happy to be free from him that they didn't need to worry about him. As they were coming down river, they stopped at the cave in Cave-in-Rock to cook them a little supper over a fire. And while soldiers were busy cooking their supper, the slave went over and untied Duff. He got one of their rifles, and he was able to overpower the soldiers. And the two of them together tied the soldiers up and put them on the canoe and sent them adrift to go on down river. So that's the second time that he escaped capture. The third time, the commander at Pike then decided to hire some Native Americans to go and capture Duff, and dead or alive, and he was killed in a shootout there at near the Tradewater River at Caseyville. And so the third time he was killed. And so 1799 is probably when he actually died, but some places have 1805. So John Duff, or Duff the Counterfeiter, he was the second person to operate out of the cave at Cave-in-Rock. Next we come to Samuel Mason. I mentioned that he, like many of these, were born out east. He did serve as an officer during the American Revolution. After the American Revolution, he made his way down in the Tennessee area. He got into some trouble in Tennessee. He made his way up through Kentucky. And then when we got to Kentucky, he eventually made his way to Red Banks, Kentucky, Henderson. And so Samuel Mason was actually the gang leader at Red Banks when the regulators came in and cleaned house. And so the gang that they kicked out of Red Banks was Samuel Mason's gang in the 1790s. And when he left there, he made his way down to the cave in Cave-in-Rock, and he set up operations there. And I mentioned that Samuel Mason's really the one, when we think of river pirates, he's the one that was operating out of the cave at Cave-in-Rock, and it was him and his gang that we really think about being river pirates. Some of the things that they would do in order to get people to stop and for them to rob them, they would place people on islands in the river, and they would have that person be on the island and acting like a stranded person on the island. So when one of these flatboats would go by, just one man would come out on the beach and start waving at the boat going back and say, "Help me, I'm stranded. Help me, my boat's sunk. I'm stranded on the island. Give me a hand." And so these people coming down aren't about to leave a lonely, stranded man on the island, so they would come and land their boat on the island to help this guy. And when they do, all the other river pirates would come out of the brush and overtake the boat, kill the people, steal the goods. Another thing that they would do is they would place women on, either women or men dressed up as women, on top of the bluffs and do the same thing. They would holler out at boats going by and say, we need help here, and what respectable man is going to pass on by and leave a poor helpless woman on a bluff screaming help and not stop to help her? And so when these boats would stop to help the poor damsel in distress, the river pirates would come out and overpower the boat and do the same thing. Another method that they used, down at the bend of the river, where the Ohio River comes past here, goes by Battery Rock and Caseyville, and then it comes down to the bend of the river in Hardin County, and then it heads back towards the west. Where it bends the river, where the bend of the river is, there was a lot of sand bars back then, especially before the dams were built. And it could be a little treacherous going through there. And so they would place somebody around Battery Rock, and they would wave down boats as they were going by, and they would tell them, there's a lot of treacherous sandbars in the river around the bend of the river, but I can pilot you through them if you'll hire me on as pilot. And they would charge them a small nominal fee to take them on board, and it was legit. They knew the way to go through the sandbars. And so people would hire them, and so they get on the boat at Battery Rock. They would get them around the bend of the river, and then in a location that they had decided ahead of time, he would land the boat, and again the river pirates would be hiding there, and they would come out and overpower the captain of the boat and overpower the boat and steal it. So these are just several ways, and then of course the cave itself also provided a place where they could lure people in. There's a story how a man by the name of Wilson put a sign out in front of the cave that said Wilson's Liquor Vault and House of Entertainment. And so as people were going down the river, these men had been on the boat for who knows how long, they'd holler at them and say, "We have some cold drinks in here. Come in, we've got the best whiskey around. We've got so come in and get you a cool drink off the river." And then again, if they had any women, they might have women on the bluff, or even men disguised as women, hollering at it and say, "Come in for some entertainment." And there was a school teacher in Hardin County, many of you might have known her, named Patsy Ledbetter. And I've heard her talk about the river pirates. She used to get on the river boats when the Delta Queen or Mississippi Queen would land and tell them stories about the river pirates. And she always told the story of the sign about the Wilson's Liquor Vault and House of Entertainment. And whenever she would tell this story, she would always talk about the liquor, and then she'd say, "And I'll let you guess what the entertainment was." and I'm going to do the same thing. So they would lure people to stop. Well, once they had them captured, there was all of these goods on the boat, and really what the river pirates are needing to do is to convert all of those goods into cash. And they're really doing the same thing that the farmers were doing when they were taking their goods to market. So the river pirates, a couple of them would then get on the person's boat and take it on downstream to Natchez or to New Orleans and sell the goods. Well, what they were supposed to do, these river pirates were supposed to go down, sell the goods, and then make their way back to the cave at Cave-in-Rock and split the money with everybody else. Now, how many do you think actually went to Natchez, had a whole pocket full of money, and knowing if they walked all the way back to Cave-in-Rock and they were going to have to split that money with all the rest of them in there, how many do you think actually made the trip back? And so one of the theories is that the reason why the criminal activity at Cave-in-Rock kind of dried up is they realized they were too far away from Natchez and New Orleans, and they were losing out on the share of the spoils of robbing these people, because people just weren't coming back with the money. They were, going off and doing their own thing somewhere else. But in 1797, I believe it is, the regulators came into Cave-in-Rock, the same group of regulators that had ran them out of Red Banks, came into Cave-in-Rock and drove the river pirates out of the Cave-in-Rock area just like they did at Red Banks. And so once the river pirates, it was Samuel Mason and his group, once they were run out of Cave-in-Rock, there's some folklore that they might have stopped around the mouth of the Cache River down in Pulaski County, Alexander County, and operated there for a while. But the next real accounts of Samuel Mason and his gang are all along the Mississippi River. And then Samuel Mason, he was killed in 1803. His criminal activity on the Mississippi River got so bad that they put a bounty on his head, dead or alive, and two people in his own gang killed him and turned his head in for the bounty that had been placed on him. And when they went in to turn the head in and for the bounty, the people in town recognized them as some of his own gang, and they were arrested as well. Now, the folklore is that the two people that killed him and turned the head in, one was Peter Alston. Peter Alston is Philip Alston's son, who ended up joining Samuel Mason's gang. The other one, according to folklore, was Little Harpe, Wiley Harpe. And after the Harpe gang broke up, he joined up with Samuel Mason and was with him on the Mississippi River, according to folklore. All of what I'm sharing is almost all folklore, because there's very, very little proof of any of this going on. But we do have substantial proof that Samuel Mason was operating out of the cave at Cave-in-Rock, and that a group of regulators did indeed drive him out of Red Banks and out of Cave-in-Rock in the 1790s. Let's see. This is a good place to talk about the Harpe brothers. Most everyone has probably heard of the Harpe brothers. If you've not, they are recognized as the first serial killers in the United States. The Harpe brothers had a gang, and really it was just the two of them and their women. There was the two brothers. Some accounts have them as cousins. There was the two of them, and then they had three women that they shared between the two of them. And they had children also by these women. The Harpe brothers were notorious in the fact that they killed just for the love of killing people, like a serial killer does. Lots of times they killed people and they didn't even rob them. They didn't take anything from them. And one of the theories behind why the Harpe brothers were so mean is that during the American Revolution, their dad they're either, if they were cousins, their dads, who were brothers, or if they were brothers, their dad and their uncle were Tories, which meant that they were backing the British during the American Revolution. They weren't backing the colonists. And so at the end of the American Revolution, they were on the wrong side. You know, the ones they backed were the ones that lost the war. And so a lot of their neighbors who were sympathetic to the American Revolution then started picking on their fathers or their father and uncle. Excuse me. And they ended up being driven away from where they lived in the Carolinas, and it just made them so mad at what had occurred, you know, how their family had been picked on, that they decided that they were going to take it out on all of society. That's the theory on why they became serial killers. And they started operating in Tennessee. They made their way up to Kentucky. Big and Little Harpe were captured along with their wives, and they were being held for trial in Russellville, Kentucky. And in Russellville, Kentucky, they were in jail, and there was no doubt that they were guilty of their crimes. There was also no doubt that they were going to be hung for their crimes. Well, Big and Little Harpe escaped from jail. The wives and the children were left behind, and when Otto Rothert wrote The Outlaws of Cave-in-Rock, he's the one that puts them at the cave in Cave-in-Rock, and there's just a short period of time that they possibly might have been there, and that was during the period of time when they escaped from the jail at Russellville. Because the next account we have of them, they're down in Tennessee again. And so that's where Rothert, when he wrote Outlaws of Cave-in-Rock, puts them at the cave at Cave-in-Rock. We have a couple of folklore tales concerning the Harpe brothers at Cave-in-Rock, and I'll share them with you now. Big Harpe and Little Harpe made their way to the cave at Cave-in-Rock. Samuel Mason and his gang were there at the time, and so they joined up with Samuel Mason and his gang. Now, I mentioned they were serial killers, and they loved to kill people just for the act of killing. You know, they had no remorse. The first story that we have, folklore tale concerning the Harpes at Cave-in-Rock, is that there was a boat coming downriver, and there was a young couple on this boat. And something happened to the tiller on the boat, so they pulled into the riverbank so that they could repair it. And they were just upriver from where the cave is today, up by where the Cave-in-Rock Lodge is, up in that area. And so the young couple that was on the boat, they decided to go up on top of the bluff and rest up there while the captain of the boat was repairing the boat. While they were up on top of the bluff, the Harpe brothers came up behind them and tried to capture them. And the young couple, there was the Harpe brothers on one side and the top of the bluff on the other, and they decided they would just jump off the bluff rather than to be captured by these the Harpe brothers. Now, you got to remember the Harpe brothers were quite a sight to see. They just looked mean and menacing. And so the story goes that the young couple grasped hands and jumped off the bluff, you know, knowing that they were probably going to be killed from the fall. But as they were falling, jumped off the bluff, they started hitting branches from various trees, and the branches from the trees buffeted their fall, and they actually survived when they landed at the bottom of the cliff. They hurriedly went to the captain, told them what happened up on top of the bluff, and the captain hurriedly got them back in. And when they went past the cave and the river pirates were trying to talk them into stopping there, they went on because they knew that there was a bunch of criminals in the area. That bluff is known as Lover's Leap, and this is the story that goes along with it. The other story concerning the Harpes is that they captured a boat one time, and the whole river pirate gang was celebrating because of the capture. And they built a big fire in front of the cave, and the river pirates were all outside celebrating because they had captured this boat. Well, the Harpe brothers took the captain of the boat, and they took him up on top of the bluff, and they had a horse that they brought up there, and they put a blindfold over the horse, and they tied the riverboat captain to horseback naked. And on top of that bluff, they walloped the backside of that horse and got it galloping and caused that horse to gallop off the top of the bluff and it and the captain both fell to their deaths right in front of the cave. And of course, all the river pirates were down there celebrating, and this happened right in front of them. They were so aghast at the Harpe brothers' meanness and what they were up to that it was too much for the Mason and his gang, and they told the Harpe brothers to get out of there, that they couldn't stay there any longer. And so the Harpe brothers made their way down, and the next place we find them, as I mentioned a while ago, is in Tennessee. Now, most people, even though we have these two folklore tales about the Harpe brothers, most do not think that the Harpe brothers were ever at the Cave-in-Rock area. But again, this is part of our folklore, and that's a couple of tales concerning them. I will mention that the women that were left behind in the Russellville jail, they did stand trial. The people in Russellville felt so sorry for these women and their children, though, that they didn't find them guilty on any of the charges. They all assumed that the men were the ones that were doing all the killing. So they let the women go and their children, and they got a bunch of supplies together for the women, and they gave them enough supplies to get on down the road. Well, when they left the area, the Harpe brothers had told the women that they were going to Cave-in-Rock, and if they got to escape, to make their way to Cave-in-Rock. And so the story goes, the women traded all the goods that they got for a canoe, and they got in the Green River and canoed up the Green River to the Ohio River, and then from the Ohio River made their way down the Ohio River, and they met back up with the Harpe brothers at the cave in Cave-in-Rock. So when the river pirates told the Harpe brothers to get out of town, we've had enough of you, the women were there by that point, and they all made their way to Tennessee. Big Harpe ended up losing his life over, not too far from here, really. They got a posse together after they had killed a man in Kentucky. They got a posse together and chased the Harpe brothers down, and they ended up capturing Big Harpe, and they cut his head off, and they put it on a pole over there. And for years, it was called Harpe's Head Road, where this head was. And if you look on a map today, there's still a Harpe's Head Road, Kentucky, where that occurred. And so they were taking the head in for a bounty, and it got to smelling, and so they put it on a spike and left it there as a warning to everybody else. And then I already mentioned Little Harpe, Wiley Harpe, how he probably met his end down in Mississippi, turning in the head of Samuel Mason for the bounty. I've got some other slides to show. Here's the one of the mold for making counterfeit coins. Here's some pictures of what I was talking about. Here's from Davy Crockett and the River Pirates. This is a keel boat, one of the types of boats that they'd be using to take goods downriver. Of course, here's a picture from inside of the cave looking out at the river. This is Tower Rock. And so when I mentioned people on top of the rocks yelling down at the boats going by, this might have been one of the perches where that they were at. And of course, this is the observation area on top of Tower Rock that you can go up and look out over the river today. So this area right here is actually like right in there. I mentioned Wilson's Liquor Vault and House of Entertainment, you know, the sign. One of the theories is that this Wilson, Jim Wilson, was an alias of Samuel Mason's. If you look at a squatter's map of Illinois, though, prior to Illinois becoming granted statehood, there is a plot of land where Elizabethtown is today, where there was a cabin, or there was a plot of land that a squatter by the name of James Wilson had that land prior to Illinois becoming state, and actually prior to the land office here in Shawneetown even being established. So, I mean, that's why he's called squatter. So James Wilson, we do have some proof that there was a James Wilson living in Illinois. And he was living in Elizabethtown, where Elizabethtown is today. And this cabin that you see right here, for years has been right on the edge of Elizabethtown, and for years was known as the River Pirates Cabin. And this cabin was in the same place that James Wilson was on the squatter's map. And so if James Wilson is the James Wilson that had Wilson's Liquor Vault and House of Entertainment, This might very well have been his cabin that he had. And this cabin today is over in Harrisburg in the Pioneer Village there. They took it from Hardin County and refurbished it, and it's now on display at the Pioneer Village in Harrisburg. You can go visit, and there's a sign there that talks about the mystery cabin of Hardin County, and it talks about how it was possibly a river pirate's cabin. So there is some, there's folklore, but then we can find just enough factual information that maybe some of this folklore actually happened. And so probably James Wilson wasn't an alias of Samuel Mason's, but was actually an early settler to Hardin County. Okay, let's talk about the end of the river pirate era. I said it was only about a 10-year period from 1790 to about 1799 is really when the river pirate era ends. When Samuel Mason and his gang were driven out of the cave at Cave-in-Rock, that pretty much brought an end to the river piracy. Well, another thing that brought the end to river piracy was the influx of people that started coming into the area. Why were all these people suddenly coming into the area? Well, in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase happened. And when the Louisiana Purchase happened, all of this land right here suddenly became part of the United States. And so both sides of the Mississippi River was now available for settlement in the United States. And people, today we know about things like crop rotation. And so you don't wear out the land when you are raising crops. There's certain things that you do, like beans and corn. You raise corn for a while, but then every so often you plant beans in that to replace it's the nitrogen, isn't it? Yeah. That you're replacing in the ground. Well, they didn't know about things like that back then, and they would overuse land to the point that you couldn't raise anything on it. Well, back in this time period, there was tons of land. So if you had overused the soil in one place, you just go and stake a claim somewhere else in some fertile ground and use it until it was used up. And so an influx of people from Kentucky and Tennessee and the Carolinas came into this area at the beginning of the 1800s because the Louisiana Purchase had opened all this area up for settlement, but it also opened up the area for trade. You could go down the river, and there was lots of people living on the river. There was lots of ports on the river where you could sell your goods also. And so there was a great influx of people at this time. Well, when a big influx of people come into the area, are they going to put up with counterfeiters? Are they going to put up with horse thieves living in their area? They're not. And so it drove them further west and further south. And so that's really what caused the end of the river pirates at the Cave-in-Rock area, was the influx of people that was coming into the area. The guy on the right is William Henry Harrison. He was the territorial governor at the time of this area. And the reason he's here, because also in 1803, he signed a treaty with all the Native American tribes in Illinois that all of their land would then be available to settlers from the United States of America. So Illinois then gets opened up to trade and gets opened up to settlement in 1803, and a ton of people start coming into the area. And that's what really killed the river pirates. But the criminals weren't completely done yet. I mentioned the last one we're going to talk about tonight is the Sturdivants, Merrick and Roswell Sturdivant, and they were counterfeiters. They operated in the 1820s. This is a view of Rosiclare from the Rose Hotel Bluff in Elizabethtown. That's the water tower in Rosiclare. The Sturdivants had a fort in where Rosiclare is today. Of course, Rosiclare wasn't there at the time. And their fort sat, see this little green area right in here? You can see it. Their fort sat right in this area. And their fort was a blockhouse fort. And this is a blockhouse. And there's some talk that it was a blockhouse and had a corridor in between them, and a log cabin was built between these two blockhouses. And so they had a fort there, and they started a counterfeiting operation. And how this ties into Cave-in-Rock, they too, like the Alstons and like Duff the counterfeiter, they did all their counterfeiting out of their fort, but they would meet people at the cave in Cave-in-Rock and used it as a banking center. Again, they would bring their counterfeit coinage there and currency. They were printing bills also. and they would trade it for legitimate currency. Again, this is in the 1820s. Well, by that time, Shawneetown is starting to really become a booming place. The land office is in Shawneetown. Of course, I'm talking about Old Town when I say Shawneetown. The land office is here. The bank is in Shawneetown. And so all of the counterfeit coinage that was being traded down at the cave by the Sturdivants started showing up in Shawneetown and was wreaking havoc with the banking center. And so they started poking around, and they found out that the Sturdivants were the ones that were leaking the counterfeit coinage. And so they got a posse together in Shawneetown to go down and to raid Sturdivant's fort. And they snuck up on him. Well, Sturdivant, not just him, but those living around that area down in where Rosiclare is today, were all part of his gang. And Sturdivant carried a bugle with him, and anytime he was in trouble, he would blow that bugle, and when he blew the bugle, all the neighbors around knew that he was in trouble and they needed to come help him. And so the posse gets down to Sturdivant's fort. They surprise him. Both Roswell and Merrick Sturdivant were in the fort. Their dad was there also. They go in there and they raid Sturdivant's fort, and sure enough, they catch them red-handed. They're counterfeiting coins. So the posse grabs them because Roswell, or Merrick, whichever one had the bugle, started blowing his bugle as soon as they attacked him. And so they knew that they had to hurry and get back to Shawneetown with them. So they grabbed them quickly, put them on horseback, and they all started making the ride back to Shawneetown. They rode all that day, and they knew they weren't going to make it to Shawneetown before dark. And so you know where they stopped? They stopped at Potts Inn. Potts Inn actually features in this story also. They spent the night at Potts Inn, and the next morning the Sturdivant gang wasn't anywhere around, and they finished their trip on into Shawneetown. When they got into Shawneetown, they brought them up on charges, and they went to indict them, and the prosecuting or the state's attorney at the time got to looking and said, "Where's the evidence?" In their hurry to get the Sturdivants out of the fort and get them to Shawneetown, they had failed to collect any evidence on them. And so they refused to prosecute at Shawneetown, and they actually let them go. So the Sturdivants went back to their fort. They went back to their counterfeiting operation. They just went back to everything. A few years later, the counterfeiting was still such a problem that they decided to get another posse together in Shawneetown. And this time, rather than going by horseback, they got a riverboat to take them downriver. And so this time, steamboats were operating on the river. So they all got on board a steamboat, went down to the Rosiclare area, and they raided the fort again. In the meanwhile, the Sturdivants had decided they better be prepared in case this happens again, and so they had purchased a small cannon and had a cannon inside their fort. And when the posse this time raided the Sturdivant fort, they were repelled by this cannon, and 3 men were killed when the cannon was shot off. The posse realized that they didn't have near enough men, so they got back on the riverboat, went down to Golconda. They recruited some more men to join their posse, went back upriver to Sturdivant's fort, and this time they raided the fort, and they were able to overpower the Sturdivants. They captured the 2 brothers, they captured the father, and this time they learned their lesson. They also gathered all the evidence. There was ink, there was paper, there was coinage, there was everything that they needed to make counterfeit coins and counterfeit bills were in the fort, and they raided the fort, and they brought it all back to Shawneetown. This time they were indicted. They were put in jail in Shawneetown, and they were getting ready to be brought up on trial. So the Sturdivants knew that they needed a pretty good lawyer. So they were looking for a lawyer in Shawneetown, and the lawyer that they hired to defend them was John McLean. John McLean was the first U.S. representative to Congress when Illinois became a state.
But also one of our the 25th president.
I don't think McLean was a president.
McLean, it will someone else. That's how it's talking.
McKinley, maybe?
William McKinley.
McKinley. All right, he was a different guy. He lived a little little bit later. So John McLean also was a Speaker of the House in Illinois in the General Assembly. He was a very prominent attorney, very prominent statesman in the Shawneetown area when Illinois became state. And John McLean is actually buried over here in Westwood Cemetery. You can go and visit his grave today. He was a very important man in 1818 and the early years of Illinois statehood. Well, he also took on the case for the Sturdivants. They were guilty of sin, so I don't know why he took the case. It must have been for the money. The way that, and let's just bring that up. They were guilty of sin, and so John McLean knew that he couldn't defend them in court and get them off. So what he started doing was putting and filing continuances. And so he can't, every time it would, their trial would come up, he would just file another continuance. Come up with some reason, and he probably had enough pool back in that day that whatever he wanted they get, and so they just kept punting the case down the docket, in the court's docket, and so he filed continuance after continuance after continuance. The father, who was also indicted in this, he dies while they're waiting for their trial to come up. Eventually, he had filed so many continuances that they just dropped the case. They realized that they were never going to be able to bring it to trial. And so they dropped the case, so Roswell and Merrick get off on it again. Well, they don't pay John McLean for getting him off. And so McLean has to then sue the Sturdivants to get money from them for defending them, his fees. Before he can collect on that, that can come to trial, John McLean dies. And so the Sturdivants get off on their case without ever having to pay a dime and without ever suffering anything. They never went to trial. After that raid, though, they did leave the area. There's one more story about Roswell. He left the area and went to Natchez. And there is a story or folklore that he got into a fight with Jim Bowie down there. The Bowie knife, Jim Bowie that went to the Alamo and was killed at the Alamo. That Jim Bowie and Roswell got into a fight, and they had a fight where they tied their wrists together, their non-dominant hand, and so they had their knife in one hand, and their other wrists were tied together so they couldn't get apart. And they fought each other, and let's see, Jim Bowie got an injury to his leg from Sturdivant, and Sturdivant had his wrist slashed, and he couldn't hold his knife anymore, and so it was called a draw when he couldn't hold his knife anymore. So anyway, that's where the Sturdivants ended up, and there's no story about how they died or where they died or anything of that nature. So this happened in the 1920s or 1820s, excuse me, and really that was the end of the river pirate era. There's other stories that maybe we'll come back and tell another day of things that happened around the Cave-in-Rock area and about Potts Inn. Of course, everybody's heard of Ford's Ferry Road and the Ford's Ferry Gang, so that might be a story for another day. Does anybody have any questions? What time is it? Seems like I've been talking a long time. Oh, about an hour. Anybody have any questions?